I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine grower. He removes every branch in me that bears no fruit. Every branch that bears fruit, he prunes to make it bear more fruit. You have already been cleansed by the word that I have spoken to you. Abide in me as I abide in you. Just as the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I am the vine, you are the branches. Those who abide in me and I in them bear much fruit, because apart from me you can do nothing. Whoever does not abide in me is thrown away like a branch and withers. Such branches are gathered, thrown into the fire, and burned. If you abide in me and my words abide in you, ask for whatever you wish, and it will be done for you. My Father is glorified by this, that you bear much fruit and become my disciples. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Well, little Thad was like a lot of 9-year-old boys, and that he was not always thrilled to death to be in synagogue school day after day after day, to listen to the old Pharisees drone on about this scroll and that scroll. Wasn't that high on his list. He often found himself in the midst of the Pharisees' teaching, daydreaming, thinking of something else, somewhere else that he would rather be. And today was no exception. The old Pharisee pulled out the scroll of Isaiah and he read the parable of the vineyard from the prophet. And immediately Thad was somewhere else. He was daydreaming, thinking about the time last summer when he spent a couple of months with his uncle working in his vineyard. His parents were on a long journey, and so he was there day after day watching his uncle, seeing how he did what he did. It was fascinating to little Thad to see him carefully tend each vine, to look at each of the branches and see what needed to be done. He would even cut some of them back. When Thad saw this for the first time, he panicked. He said, no, you're going to hurt the plant. Don't. And of course, his uncle smiled and said, no, that's not what I'm doing. I'm pruning it. I'm cleaning it. I'm helping it to grow stronger by cutting it back. Thad looked and he scratched his head and he asked, well, how do you know? How do you know what to cut and what not? And again, his uncle smiled and he said, well, you have to watch the vine. For the branches that are close to the vine receive the nutrients from it, and they can bear incredibly rich and luscious fruit. But the farther away it gets from the vine, the more it rambles and brambles and moves away, the less the nutrients reach it. And the weaker the fruit becomes. You have to watch the vine. Now Thad was snapped back into place by the Pharisee, and so he figured while he was daydreaming, he might as well tell the story to the rest of the class, and so he told the Pharisee and all the rest of the boys about what he had remembered about the vine and the branches. And the Pharisee got a gleam in his eye like all teachers do when they know that there's a chance for a light bulb to come on. And he said, that's exactly what the prophet meant. The prophet knew that there was time, that there had to be things that were cut back in order to bring justice. You see, he was talking about those who had failed to produce the fruit of justice. They continued to build and build and build and build, even though there were those on the outside who had nowhere to live. They continued to abuse the land that God had given them and did not care for it as good stewards. They continued to eat whatever they wanted and more while those next door went hungry. The prophet said, "This angers God." And God, out of that anger, would destroy the fruitless vineyard. It was a lesson that little Thad never forgot. In fact, as he grew up and became Thaddeus, he still remembered that day. And one day, some 20 years later, he found himself in the midst of another teacher who was teaching about life and justice. And this teacher began to teach him by serving, by showing him what it meant to love. But still, Thaddeus couldn't quite get it. He was still trying to make sense of it. "How do you know?" he asked. How do you know if it's the good news for us, for the family, for the people of God, or if it's good news for maybe the whole world? And the teacher got that gleam in his eye that teachers get when they know the light bulb's getting ready to come on, and he said this: "I am the vine. You are the branches. The Father is the gardener that tends to the vine. As you are in me, so you are in the Father." And even after all those years, Thaddeus remembered. He remembered back to the prophet. He remembered back to his uncle. He remembered back to that moment in which he began to understand, and it all became clear. Everything that the teacher had taught about loving your neighbor, about turning the other cheek, about living a life of justice and mercy and love, became clear in that moment. It became obvious to him as he sat in that upper room. How do you know? You watch the vine. Well, Judge Thad took his normal pew in the 10th row. He was very clear that this was his pew, and he counted back every single Sunday when he began the worship service. This Sunday morning, the preacher read from the Gospel of John about the vine and the branches, and he began to daydream, as not only young boys and young men do. And as he began to daydream, he started thinking of his own to-do list in the garden. He remembered the roses that needed to be deadheaded. He remembered the mums that need to be pinched back. He remembered last year's growth that needed to be cut clean down so that it could grow again. And as he went through that list, he looked around from his spot on the 10th row, and he began to think about some of the dead wood in his own church. He began to look around and say, I bet we could do from a little cutting away. I bet our church could do better if we got rid of some of the dead weight. He thought about the single mom who came to church whenever she needed something, according to Judge Thad. The one that always seemed to be asking for more money, asking for more help, being a drain on the resources of the church as a whole. He thought about the interracial couple that always sat in the back of the church, always talked about how they were victims. He was thinking of them when he shared that Facebook post titled, "Why Don't You Just Get Over It?" He thought of the old chair of the property department The one who micromanaged every little piece of the building and went around telling people what they should do with every room and every corner. He thought about the pastor and the ways that she had to deal with his incessant micromanaging, and thought, what if we just cut away the dead wood? Then this church could really grow. These were the things he thought of as the choir finished their anthem, and then the preacher stood up to speak. Immediately he found his toes stepped on quite cleanly. For she began, "Is yours a theology of cutting away or cutting back?" Jesus talks about the difference in the passage of the vine and the branches. He said some are cut away, but most of what happens is a cutting back, a pruning, a cleaning, a preparing in order to grow more fruit. To look at the life of Jesus, one could see that he really didn't do much cutting away. Even as he told this metaphor of the vine and the branches, he had just washed the feet of the man that would betray him. He went through his life not cutting away, not rejecting. It wasn't even a rejection of the rich young ruler, but an invitation that was not accepted. No, what Jesus did was cut back. Jesus pruned. Jesus took that which was in the lives of the disciples and everybody he met, and he helped to strengthen it, to enrich it, to make it stronger. He helped to cut back, to prune that which was not healthy in our lives. And so he taught his disciples and everybody that took the time to listen to him about the importance of love, about the importance of justice, about the importance of mercy, about the importance of knowing and caring for one another. These are the things that he taught us to do. And he taught us that when we say yes to these things, we must say no to others. We must say no to the self-righteousness that thinks that we know all the answers. We must say no to the apathy that thinks somebody else will take care of it. We must say no to the assumptions and the prejudice and the sexism and the racism in our hearts and in our lives. And Judge Thad turned beet red as he sat and heard. And in his spot, in the 10th row, in that moment, he had what only could be called an epiphany. For he looked around again at the people in his midst, and he saw them with new eyes. He saw the single mom with new eyes, understanding now her insurmountable debt that keeps coming back with bill after bill after bill, and her spotty attendance as a reality of sick kids and difficult schedules. He saw her now as a part of the branches, the family, the garden of faith. He saw with new eyes the interracial couple, understood how difficult it was to face day after day the eyebrows raised, the strange looks, even here in the church, even from himself. And he saw them now as a part of the garden of faith that they shared. He even saw the old trustee in a new light, understanding that this is somebody that used to do everything And now as he got older, he simply couldn't. And he was feeling out of control and out of touch. And so his way to react and to respond was to make sure everybody else knew how he used to do it. And he saw with new eyes that he was a part of the garden, the vineyard of faith. And in that day, in that epiphany on the 10th row, he began to understand that his was a theology of cutting away and not one of cutting back. One that would prefer that those people just stay out of his life, stay out of his business, stay out of his church. But instead, God was inviting him to be pruned himself, to be strengthened for himself, to bear better fruits. And the question came to mind one more time, and throughout the generations has come back again and again and again. How do you know? And the preacher stood in the final glorious words of her sermon and said it clearly and honestly. You watch the vine. You follow the example of the one who taught us how. And in our connection with the Lord of love and the Prince of peace and the great physician who heals, we too become branches ready to bear more fruit. May it be so for Judge Thad and for each of us today. Amen.